Welcome back to Boyd Book Club. Today we are dealing with what I'm referring to as the intersection of mind and action, and what we're going to do is continue to explore Chuck Spinney's Evolutionary Epistemology and how it relates to applying Boyd's work in our day-to-day lives. So with that said, we're going to jump to slide 40 in Spinney's Evolutionary Epistemology briefing and bringing these ideas together. And what ideas is he talking about? He's talking about these two ideas of Boyd's, that machines don't fight wars, people do when they use their minds. And the second idea is that one cannot determine the character or nature of a system within itself. Moreover, attempts to do so lead to confusion and disorder. Where do these ideas matter in this context of the intersection of mind and action? Ultimately, what it comes down to is this. Humans are not mechanical engines. When we talk about mechanical engines, we are talking about anything that can be replicated through geared action, right? So if you think about an old school cash register where you had to punch a analog button and that would turn a series of gears, as those gears aligned inside, it would perform addition operations, right? So a machine, and in this case I'm using some of Douglas Hofstadter's language out of his book Google Escher-Bach, and a machine can be unobservant of its environment. It can simply take input and crank out a pre-programmed output. Humans can be taught to behave in an unobservant way, and yet, even when given mechanical rote tasks, human beings will pull back from that action, use their mind, and behave in an observant way. In that sense, they are both engaged in the act of doing within their environment, but they are also applying their cognitive capacities to understand that environment. The second point here, that we can't determine the character or nature of a system from within itself, is really Boyd invoking all three of his trinity here. That the second law of thermodynamics is in play, that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is in play, and that Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. All bear on this central point, that we can't determine the character or nature of a system within itself. So how do these three elements come to play? Well, when we consider the second law, right, if we are thinking about the intersection of mind and action, we should be thinking about how those observant animals use their minds to understand the world around them. Absent observation, absent our reliance on observation and our willingness to accept observations, we are in effect behaving as closed systems. And closed systems inevitably lead to entropy, according to the second law of thermodynamics, meaning that they become more disordered, make more chaotic, right? So if we are focused inward within ourselves, this is where the second law comes into play, that it's going to lead to confusion and disorder through the increase in entropy. Further, if we consider uncertainty in play, we are trying to determine the character or nature of the system, right? So when we try and determine anything, we begin to lose precision. So if we remember, what the uncertainty principle tells us is that there is a relationship between our change in position and our change in velocity. And that the difference, that as we increase in a certainty of our position, we decrease the understanding of how fast we're going, and vice versa. This is directly related to determining the character or nature of a system, and that the more precision we apply to a particular aspect of the system, the less certainty we can have about the other constituent elements within that system. And we come to Gödel's understanding that we cannot prove a system from within itself, right? So that this character or nature of a system from within itself cannot be proven. What this means, Gödel's actual discussion is about axiomatic systems. And in this way, he is talking about abstract formal systems. And those abstract formal systems can't be proved from within themselves. There has to be a meta-language, a external language to talk about the proofs of that system. And we talked about that a little bit when we were discussing formal logic before, and the idea that the axioms of a if P then Q, P therefore Q system, the rules that apply to making that formal system work don't exist within that set of postulates. So when we consider all three of these things together, we see where Boyd's concept is that the intersection of mind and action requires us to recognize that we are observing creatures, we are observant beings, but it is only through the effective use of that observation that we can change and shape the system that we exist within, and we must step outside of that system in order to do so effectively. Jumping then to Spinney's slide 43, what we want to observe here is the recognition that where the real world interacts with the OODA loop is outside of the OODA loop. The OODA loop is a model of human thinking. It is not describing all of human thinking. It is not describing everything that exists within the human mind at any given snapshot in time. What it is giving us is a broad abstraction to begin to discuss and discern ways of thinking. So where this becomes important is to remember that everything that happens within the loop is happening inside the system, and that the only way to keep that system from eating its own tail effectively, to keep it from increasing in its disorder, is by injecting information from the real world in terms of outside information, unfolding circumstances, and our unfolding interaction with the environment. It is only by allowing these things in and then acting on the real world where we begin to get outside of the OODA loop system itself, the model described of systemic human thinking. And it is only in doing so that we now create an open system. This understanding, this recognition of where the intersection of mind and action comes into play is particularly important as we continue our discussion in weeks to come, as we continue our discussion about the centrality of orientation. Because orientation has so much to do with how we use this information, but it also shapes the information that we take in. Recognizing this, recognizing these two things, leads to Spinney's impression number 2 in slide 46, that it is only an observation and an action where the OODA loop comes in contact with the external environment, with reality. And this is important because if all of these other operations are internal, then we must be aware of the fact that all of the internal processes of orientation and decision can take us in a direction of being focused on the system itself, inwardly focused on the system and trying to determine the character or nature of the system from within itself. This is what happens when we begin to narrativize things that are happening in our world based upon an observation that we then keep internally looping, right? So I have an interaction with my boss, right? That interaction is an observation that comes in, that pings around in orientation for a while. I then feed it forward to my hypothesis stage about what my boss may think, what my boss may want, and I then go through a simulation phase to determine the character or nature of that statement. Well, that iterative process, all happening here, this has a disastrous potential quality in that it is isolated from reality. And when we think about all of the times that we have gotten worked up or upset at a coworker, a boss, a child, a spouse, anybody else that we may interact with, it is oftentimes the story that we are telling in our head, the narrative that we are creating to explain our observations that then lead to an outsized, unreasonable action. So, how then do we take our constituent knowledge of the OODA loop and our thinking and begin to apply it as we consider the way we intersect and act in the outside world, the way we bring our mind into action with the outside world? Well, we want to come back to what Spinney observed earlier, that it is only at observation and action that we are actually interacting with the outside world. Everything else is an internal system and therefore is prone to increasing chaos and disorder through being internally referential without access to outside information. Further, we have a couple of functions in the loop that we need to be aware of and how they are going to interact. Right? We have our implicit guidance and control arms. And the thing to remember about implicit guidance and control is that ultimately it is what is known as the heuristics that we all base our actions on, right? So both functions of the implicit guidance and control arm are quick and easy. They are natural. They come instinctively to us, both in how we interact with the world, our implicit actions, and in how orientation shapes our observations. Now, Spinney points out this idea that there is always a danger of incestuous amplification between orientation and observation. And this is something that I think is really, really useful. Anybody who has heard feedback at a concert or at a show recognizes that if you get a microphone too close to a speaker, it creates a constant loop of signal, and that signal becomes noise. It is no longer effectively a signal that is usable. It becomes disordered and chaotic because it is operating within an eternal closed loop. So this incestuous amplification has real bearing on how we use our orientation to help keep us in touch with reality and in touch with the real world. What we want to see is that we are continually accessing this new information that is coming in through observation and recognizing as best as possible how it ties to reality so that we dampen the effects of that incestuous amplification. We dampen the increase in noise and allow true signal to come through. Ultimately, what does this mean? This means watch out for your narrative. Watch out for the story that you tell. This is our storytelling aspect. This is how we begin narrativizing what our spouse meant when they left this morning, what our coworker meant, what our boss meant. As we begin that process of iterating through possible options, that story begins to shape our observations. Think about someone you know who is always the victim, somebody who has no effective responsibility for the things that unfold in their lives. That is a story that they often tell themselves. I'm not talking about real victims here. I am talking about the individual who perceives every action, as the universe, the world, individuals are out to get them, and create a story that is, in fact, self-referential and amplified. The other side of the implicit guidance and control is where that German word that I so love, Fingerspitzengefühl, comes in. It is using our implicit repertoires of skills to act within the environment. Fingerspitzengefühl ties to other concepts like recognition, prime decision making. It ties to our immediate action type activities. It is our shaping of action from orientation, and it comes almost instinctually. Now, one of the problems that we have with this implicit guidance and control of action is that when we are confronted with a novel circumstance, with a novel environment, with a novel observation, that existing repertoire of skills is not always going to be the right one. And we always have the risk of applying this implicit, quick and easy decision, this heuristic, and now having it backfire on us. The bottom half of the loop is where our learning is occurring and where we are creating new repertoires, either because we are dealing with a novel environment and therefore have to slow down the process and go through a difficult process of decision making, right? One that Spinney describes as possibly feeling unnatural and unnerving because it recognized that we need to go through a process of deduction and synthesis, of analysis and synthesis that often requires coming back to the reality of the world, perhaps being open enough to new information to discount what we have already learned, what we have already come to accept implicitly. And as a result, it is this slow process of learning and acclimatizing new skill repertoires that we can apply. In this way, the OODA Loop is the intersection of our mind and action. It describes not only how our thinking intersects with our actions, but also how it shapes and is shaped by those things. This is what Boyd comes back to time and time again, and it's what we need to think about as we consider the OODA Loop as a tool. I hope this begins to give us a sense of how the model of the OODA Loop describes so much about our thinking and also provides us with those warnings about where our thinking can go awry. This requires a lot of thinking and study. I have come back to that point time and time again, and I will come back to that point time and time again. You have to sit down and think about this system. You have to come back and think about this model and how various thoughts that Boyd has talked about apply. Going back and rereading Destruction and Creation time and time again, I have found is one of the most useful tools for pulling apart the OODA Loop. What Boyd has created in illustrating the OODA Loop with the help of Spinney and Chet Richards is to abstract but also illustrate that thinking process that he describes in Destruction and Creation. It provides us with a visual understanding, a set of cues and clues that we can use to understand his thinking about that dialectic engine. And using these two tools, I find is incredibly useful. It leads to many, many points of departure, many discussion points that one needs to explore. And if you look at Boyd's reading lists, if you look at the reading lists I've published, you see where it has to go. I joke only partially that I ended up going back to school to finish my bachelor's degree in order to be able to dissect the OODA Loop more and more. Thank you to the Patreons for making these videos possible. Truly support it. Please, if you're interested in seeing more of this work come out, encourage other people to join in on Patreon. Share the work that we're doing here and let them know that there's some interesting stuff that they might learn from. As always, thanks for taking some time out of your day and spending it with me. I'll see you soon.